Uh, Welcome to everyone. If you like, you can hit speaker view in the upper right of your Zoom window there. Warmest welcome to everyone. I hope you can all hear me, see me. We have a large international audience today. Many of you are friends. Some of you have been involved in the Arvo Pärt project since it began in 2012. My co-founder, Nicholas Reeves, is here. Some of you are authors of the book that we're launching today. I also see that Jonas Sildre, who did the beautiful cover art, he's also here. We have people listening in from Estonia, Switzerland, Portugal, Lithuania, Great Britain, North America, and elsewhere. We're delighted that you are here. I'd like to thank the Estonian Consulate General of New York for their support of this event, as well as Fordham University Press. Fordham Press, by the way, is offering a discount code on the book. Let me see if I can show you that. The discount code is Arvo 30. So if you go to the fordhampress.com website, search for Arvo, you'll find this book. And then when you check out, enter Arvo 30 into the code window and you'll get 30% off this fantastic book. That's just for you guys for listening in today. You're welcome. That's from Fordham Press. So that's a generous offer on their part. Arvo 30. How can you remember? All right. We're going to spend the next hour, hour and a quarter together, and we'll be hearing from each of our distinguished panelists. Afterwards, we'll be engaging with you all in discussion through the chat window. You can begin contributing whenever you like into the chat window with questions, thoughts. For now, I'm going to ask everybody to go on mute and kindly stay there for the duration of our afternoon. Today's event is about the music of Arvo Pärt, and I'm sure you knew that. We've already gotten so many messages from you about how much you love this music. We all have that in common, don't we? Much has been said and written about his music and its power. A lot has been written about its spiritual power. A lot has been written about silence as well. What this book and this afternoon is about, however, is about the music as physical, not just spiritual, not just silence, but sound, because music is sound and sound is physical. Sound impacts the body, not just the eardrum, but the whole of the body. And we wonder together how it is that Pärt's music has this effect on our bodies. And so to begin with, I'd like to ask you to take 5 minutes to listen together quietly to a Pärt composition called Da Pacem, about 5 minutes long. We're going to listen to it and we're going to listen attentively. We're going to be attentive to the effect on our bodies, on our minds, on our spirits, on our whole selves. Here we are. Especially since this whole book is about the embodied reality of the music. When we were putting this webinar together, we thought it would be terrible to have it without listening to music, actually, without listening and experiencing its effect. And so that's what we've just done, which makes speaking afterwards almost like an act of sullying the purity of the sound that we've just heard. Nonetheless, we have a job to do, and we look forward to continuing to talk with you. I am going to shortly introduce our panelists. On the way to that, I'd like to just tell you a little bit of the backstory of how this book got going. Let me try to share my screen again. The Institute of Sacred Arts at St. Vladimir Seminary, where I teach, sponsored a conference with the help of the Henry Luce Foundation. That was in 2017, under the auspices also of the Arvo Pärt project, which, as I mentioned earlier, has been a reality since 2012. The conference was already called Sounding the Sacred, and it gathered an international group of speakers and performers. It was a remarkable event of great joy, lasting 3 days in May of 2017. There were shorter and longer papers. There was a major concert as well that focused also on the sonic effect of Pärt's music. Of course, it's all about sound. We realize that, but we chose compositions for this concert that really focused on the spareness of the sound. And so a few rarely performed pieces were performed, such as Sarah Was 90 Years Old. We invited the Huiverts ensemble, a Flemish ensemble who performed Stabat Mater in just intonation, giving it, again, a very particular sonic palette and a sonic effect. So that was a memorable event. We had a voice from a Sufi Islam theologian who also brought some dervish dancers in order to do a performance. We had other pop-up performances. So it was a remarkable event. And in the intervening years, my co-editors and I, Rob Saylor and Jeffers Engelhardt, who are with us today as panelists, assembled the most notable papers into this book. And we solicited one or two more. I'll show you the table of contents of the book. Just briefly, we have an introduction, Toomas Siitan, Estonian musicologist, Chris May from Australia, Kevin Carnes from Emory University, an interview between myself and Paul Hillier, Andrew Shenton, another great Pärt scholar, Jeffers, Andrew Albin, who I believe is with us today, teaching at Fordham, Maria Cizmic, who is with us today, and Adriana Helbig wrote a beautiful piece that she's going to tell you about, based on Pärt and the body and the piano. Rob Saylor, who's with us today, Father Ivan Moody, Alex Lingus, who just came on. Hi, Alex. And Sevin Yaraman. So it's an exciting book, very diverse in its holdings, and yet tied together by this theme of embodiment. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Maria Cizmic, who I have the honor of knowing, especially since this conference. She is a professor at the University of South Florida in musicology. Among other things, she is the author of Performing Pain, Music and Trauma in Eastern Europe, which has a wonderful chapter that involves the use of tabula rasa in cinema. She has a lot to talk to us about today. I really look forward to what you're going to tell us. And I'll go through one panelist after the next. We have Maria, Jeffers, Rob, and Jaanika. And then I look forward to all of us interacting with you through the chat function. Maria, talk to us, please.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you really to Peter and Jaanika for inviting me to participate in this event, and to Peter and Jeffers and Robert for editing such a wonderful volume, and to everyone who's participating with us today. It's a pleasure to be here. So I thought I'd start out by saying a few things about the book chapter specifically, and then about my work generally. So the book chapter really came together and was shaped at that conference that Peter mentioned, Sending the Sacred. And it's been an important part of my research for a long time to write about the physicality of learning and performing piano music. In a previous life, I was kind of a pianist, I guess. Anyways, and so I had decided at some point to develop an old idea I had had back from when I was writing my dissertation to do a phenomenological discussion and analysis of learning to play Fiorellina. I think as a teaching assistant, I taught a day on Arvo Pärt's music, and I thought like, oh, I play piano, I'll play Fiorellina, and then I think I played it badly. And I played a few wrong notes, and it just was so jarring that it really, I was embarrassed. And then I started to think about it, and it really, you know, led me to kind of think about like, well, it is simple, but then not that simple. Because in fact, there's a lot to it to play it well and create kind of the right effect. So anyways, that formed the basis of my conference paper, where it came from. And it was really a remarkable experience that I was paired on the conference panel with Adriana Helbig, who is an ethnomusicologist. And Adriana presented a great paper on the representation of Arvo Pärt playing piano in several documentary films about him. And she was really similarly grounded in phenomenology, so much so that without ever having met before, our papers really spoke to one another. And as many of you know, that's a really kind of rare thing. So let's see. So then I think it came to Jeffers. He suggested that we combine the two papers and co-write the chapter. Kevin Carnes shared with me a recording of the first performance of Fiorellina in Tallinn in 1976 at the first Tintinabuli concert. And so just as a preview of the chapter, we ended up providing, I think, a renewed attention to the role of the piano in Pärt's music. We may not think of him as primarily a piano composer, but if you think of all those early Tintinabuli pieces, a lot of them have a prominent role for piano. We brought together methodological approaches regarding music and embodiment, both from ethnomusicology and musicology. And with that in mind, we raised several ideas about how Fiorellina seemed to me to manipulate expectations I had based on my experience of playing tonal music. And then we more generally kind of thought about the role of specific instruments in Pärt's music and how the piano in particular creates sound, how that sound decays, and the role of the piano pedal in sort of creating these kind of washes of sound. In my work generally, Peter mentioned the book, Performing Pain. I'd say that Arvo Pärt's music has really been an important through line in my career, really. And what I'm most known for is connecting music studies with trauma studies. So when I decided to focus on the late socialist period in Eastern Europe, and I write about, in addition to Pärt, I've written about Gorecki and Galina Ustvolskaya and Alfred Schnittke. I noticed in my initial research that a lot of the reception of these composers repeatedly linked their music to themes of historical trauma and suffering. And I started this work at its very initial stages in the late 90s and early 2000s. So right in that post-socialist moment when there was a renewed interest, I think, internationally in composers from formerly socialist countries. And at that time, I kind of felt that like the Western reception that framed Pärt's music in terms of trauma and suffering leaned a bit on that stereotype of Eastern Europe as a place where like bad things happen and there's lots of suffering. And being the daughter of immigrants from Eastern Europe, I know that lots of nice things happen there too. But it was an interesting thread that I pulled on, and it led me to read a lot of trauma studies and then start to think about how music might be understood to represent trauma and pain. And so there were really kind of two big arguments. One point I was trying to make is a historical one. So when I looked to the scholarship on Eastern Europe and late socialist literature and film and art, there's a lot of discussion of the preoccupation among the intelligentsia in starting the late 60s, 70s, 80s with history and memory. And I wanted to link the ways in which composers like Pärt, but also Schnittke and Gorecki, who are integrating past musical styles into their compositions, to kind of connect that to this broader cultural preoccupation with like cultural memory and history. The second argument is because that historical memory was often centered around the Second World War and Stalinism, those memories were often tied to trauma. And so that led me to think about how we might start to understand music's ability to represent pain and the effects of trauma. And so to do this, I've often turned to film music in part. And as we know, Pärt's Tintinnabuli music has been used in a lot of movies. And as Peter mentioned, I've written about Pärt's music in Repentance. The Georgian director Tengiz Abuladze used the second movement of Tabula Rasa to frame a narrative about Stalinism as a cultural trauma. And that film really was an important sort of text, or an important sort of cultural event that sort of marked the Glasnost era when it came out in the mid to late 80s. And then later in an essay for a book edited by Laura Dolb, I looked at more contemporary films and argued that it's become a kind of trope in terms of using Pärt's music to mark a kind of serious or even ethical stance on the part of the filmmakers towards the violence and trauma represented on screen. So that gives you a kind of flavor for the book chapter and a flavor for the kinds of things that I've written about more generally. Thank you.
I so appreciate that, Maria. Thank you. Can you just say a little more about the use of tabula rasa in the Georgian film Repentance? How
Sure.
what gave it its power in that film?
So I don't know if many people have watched the film who are here today. It's a great movie. Go and watch it. But it's also a kind of crazy movie because it's at times like a fairly Black comedy. So it's fairly allegorical. It's set in Georgia, so it's a small Georgian town. And the mayor, who was a kind of stand-in for Stalin, actually they gave him like a little Hitler mustache, and he sings Italian opera like Mussolini, and he is Georgian like Stalin. So he's this kind of almost symbolic figure of 20th century totalitarian leaders. He dies, and that sparks this kind of reckoning. So it starts out very farcical. Someone keeps digging his body up and posing him in funny places in funny ways. But what that sparks is a lot of remembering. So a woman whose parents had been essentially disappeared and assassinated under this mayor's regime comes forward, and she starts recounting her story and her history. And tabula rasa gets used in these scenes that are not at all ironic. They even Abuladze in different interviews sort of talks about how his film sort of kind of moves between these like allegorical, almost like blackly comic sections with like serious, more stable, like I want to say passages, but sections of the movie that are more historical, like not like they're kind of presenting a kind of fictionalized scenes of things that did happen under the Stalinist regime. And so it's really in those moments that when the mother and daughter are looking for any evidence of their missing father and husband, later when another neighbor has been taken away and is missing, you hear the second movement of tabula rasa, of Silentium, against these very mournful scenes. And so I think what Abuladze was sort of after was sort of, in this glasnost moment, in this moment when like the Soviet was a kind of big public conversation about how to understand the Stalinist period, a kind of reinvigorated kind of investigating into what really happened, that he really framed this kind of ethical conversation about the effects of that era on different generations, and sort of used Pärt's music to sort of mark these moments that were kind of serious moments of mourning, but also of a kind of collective trauma as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Jeffers Engelhardt has been involved in some way in the Arvo Pärt project since its beginnings, and was certainly a major aficionado of the music, and also more generally of Estonian music and Estonian singing and Estonian church singing specifically, on which he has published more than one book. He's teaching at Amherst College, and your chapter, Jeffers, in this book is maybe one of the more emblematic, really, of what the book intends to do. It focuses so very deeply and technically on the sonic element of Pärt's music. And like Maria and Adriana's essay, it also has a certain focus on für Alina. I'm not sure if that opening octave of B has ever received quite so much attention in sonic in sonic focus as it has in your essay. I look forward to hearing what you have to tell us today, Jeffers.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you to everyone here joining us. It's a real honor to get to share the story of this project and to celebrate the community that's formed around this book. So it's a real pleasure. So yes, I think I'll accept your invitation to linger a little more on those opening notes, and maybe use that as a window into the part of this project that's really emerging out of an interdisciplinary engagement with sound studies, an academic discipline that covers music studies and psychoacoustics and all different fields where texts become sound and material becomes set in motion and vibrating, the ways in which those phenomena cut across and interconnect different disciplines. That's really one of the things that this book is bound together with, and something that it celebrates, teasing out all of those new, refreshing intersections that come together in Pärt's music. So I think one of our missions in this project is not only to look at how sound studies gets a footing in Pärt's music, and both in the pre-Tintinnabuli and Tintinnabuli style, but also to think about what lessons we might share with other disciplines and make gestures outward beyond Pärt studies per se, thinking about what contributions we can make to other folks who are looking at the intersections between sound and the sacred and materiality. So those opening seconds of Für Alina, I think very much like Maria, my early encounters with Pärt were as a pianist back in my conservatory days, and also the kind of shocking, challenging mode of relating to the instrument and way of listening to the instrument that I was forced to come to grips with in my first encounters as a performer. And I remember it opened up an entire new way of listening to the instrument, the ways in which, trying not to get too technical, I'll save that for your reading of my chapter, but the ways in which the inharmonicity of the piano, the ways in which pianos are tuned, but also resonate in naturally occurring ways, and the ways that those different kinds of resonance create all sorts of wonderful acoustic phenomena that make sound, that emphasize the kind of temporal duration of sound, and the ways in which timbres and sonic details evolve through time. That's something that's really at the heart of this chapter, really unpacking the ways in which to understand Pärt's music, there are many very well-worn paths, fantastic paths in Pärt scholarship that are looking analytically at the algorithms of the Tintinnabuli style, that are also looking at the kind of cultural footing that Pärt's music assumes within and beyond Estonia. And I think one of the interventions that this book is trying to make is to also think seriously about the implications of a material approach to the sound. In other words, what are the psychoacoustic implications? How this kind of difficult thing to put your hand on that nonetheless matters so much in music, which is timbre, the actual textures and tastes and sound qualities that we usually just have to resort to language to capture through adjective or metaphor, but that are really important analytically, and that lead us into one of the things that I've really valued in the Arvo Pärt project, and something that's come together in the community of this book and in the kind of work that it's done. And that would be addressing the question of how does sound become sacred? What I really appreciate in the community and in the work that's in the book is that there are approaches that are coming from a theological, religious place, and there are approaches that are coming from a non-religious, non-theological place. And if we take a sort of a neutral stance on the per se sacrality of sound, we can arrive at a place where both of those perspectives come together. We have scholarship that's rooted in an understanding of material as created and divine and bearing the sacred. And we have maybe an anthropological approach that asks how humans make material sacred and how humans enter into relationship with the divine in material ways. So the sound studies emphasis on materiality and vibration and perception and the active creative role of the listener, whatever that listener's spiritual, cognitive, musical orientation might be. I think there's a real blossoming in this project that is bringing together in really important ways for Pärt scholarship and for those of us who work on the intersections of religion and sound and music more generally. There are really valuable perspectives that come together in this work, precisely from those two perspectives. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Jeffers. A quick follow-up question for you. Out of many contemporary composers, we know that Pärt is one of the most performed living composers today, but we could say that every composer is interested in sound because they're composing music, which is sound. And yet we argued altogether, I think, in this conference that there's a certain specific focus that Pärt brings to sound. And there are a few clues as to that specific care that he has. And some of it has to do with the way in which he orchestrates his compositions. In some cases, one composition can have up to 17 different orchestrations. Also his relationship with Manfred Eicher and the care that they take in engineering, etc. Do you want to just say another word about that, Jeffers?
Of course, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I think, so there's several important things. One, I would say it's something that lots of scholars have remarked upon, and many have taken in really interesting pathways, and that is Pärt's experience in the recording studio and in understanding the technical aspects of the recording process and production process, and the ways in which that sensitivity toward acoustic phenomena and the techniques of recording, I think actually we underemphasize the feedback loop where the experience of recording informs the composition process and the Pärt sound that has occupied us. As we know, it's only later on in the process, after an authorized recording is usually made, that Pärt kind of materializes his idea of a work in a finished version of the score. And I think it's precisely because that there's a living interaction with sound that might inform some changes that are made. I will say one other idea that's specific to my chapter in the volume, and something that I kind of tried to push forward, and that's this idea about silence. I think there's from a sort of an anthropocentric perspective, all silence is metaphorical. We can't truly experience silence until we are no longer, and we are not in fields of vibrational energy. And let's hope that that moment is far off. But there's another kind of silence, I think, that emerges from the space and care and generosity that Pärt lets musical materials interact through. And so that very beginning opening moments of for Alina, for example, when we are invited to and maybe even pushed towards really attending to the micro-timbral, microsonic, kaleidoscopic changes that are happening to the sound. And when we listen to sound at that level, some sound studies scholars have called this reduced listening, where we listen only to sound as a, in its kind of phenomenality. We stop listening to sound as something that has discursive, representative meanings that are asking us questions, or that are encouraging us to think about the sources of those sounds. In these rarefied moments when we dwell on sonic phenomena per se, one of the points that I try to make is that that's another kind of silence. It silences the kind of inner languaging that we often have accompanying our experience of music, and it lets us do this the work of listening in a way that perhaps Pärt is inviting us to do.
Thank you. That's just a perfect answer to what I was hoping you might talk about. I like how you speak of Pärt's music as, among other things, generous and inviting. As a way to kind of transition to our next panelist, Rob Saylor, I'd introduce the fact that the Arvo Pärt project began as a way to sort of explore the spiritual kind of connections. His music is often called spiritual, whatever people may mean by that. And then what does it mean that this person is lodging himself in a particular church, and that his music is texted, most all of it is texted with sacred texts. And so exploring that question is something one has to do in a very careful and non-imposing way, a propositional way, lest anybody fear that theology is trying to colonize Pärt's music. Heaven forbid, so to speak. And Pärt himself is so adamant that his music is for everyone and anyone of any sensibility whatsoever. Rob Saylor, who's a close friend and a deeply respected scholar, has made several forays in his own written work into theology and music. I think, yeah, it is still his most recent publication is All These Things into Position, subtitled What Theology Can Learn from Radiohead. Not what Radiohead can learn from theology, as if theology has something to teach Radiohead, thanks very much. No, it's the other way around. And so it's this kind of humble and sonically and intellectually curious approach, and very eclectic approach that he brings to this and whatever project he is involved in. He's one of the more creative theologians and music aficionados working today. So I'm really looking forward to introducing the third of our co-editors, Rob Saylor, who teaches at Christian Theological Seminary and is going to talk to us. Rob, talk to us.
Thank you very much, Peter. My chapter in this book has a lot to do with the theological implications of ambience. And so this afternoon, I want to expand on some of those thoughts a little bit to explore what I take to be what I hope will be the interest of this volume for theologians of various stripes, both those coming from a confessional theological position, or as Jeffers indicates, scholars of religion who are interested in how these sorts of things are talked about, what value this volume, I hope, will hold for them. In my estimation, one of the most exciting things about this volume is that across multiple disciplines, history, musicology, theology, performance studies, the various contributors show how Pärt's genius lies not in whole cloth innovation, but rather in absorbing, synthesizing, and ultimately transforming and elevating a number of key trends in his context. So we have authors who describe how the growing disillusionment with the solely deconstructive composition methods among the avant-garde in the Soviet Union, a disillusionment that eventuated in Pärt's case, as well as in several others, with a new embrace not only of previous eras of composers, but also spiritual currents of Christian orthodoxy. And then we have authors who point out things like how the supposed discontinuity between Pärt's film work and the eventual Tintinabuli compositions has been overstressed or overblown. And that's not to mention the various authors of the chapters who find new connections between Pärt's work and, for instance, medieval textual and musical trends, Richard Rolla and such. And the point I want to make, and it's a point that I think the three of us, Peter Jeffers and I, try to make in our introduction, is that that kind of contextualizing work doesn't take away from the genius of Pärt's work or the magnitude of his achievement. It actually enhances it. And here, for just a couple of minutes, I think showing how this works theologically might actually be helpful in showing how it works artistically. So the Christian tradition, broadly speaking, has an uneasy relationship with the idea that value comes from pure innovation, pure sui generis creation without any precedent. On the one hand, most Christians read, for instance, the book of Genesis as describing a God who creates ex nihilo from nothing. And, we're in the Advent season where Christians also commemorate and re-celebrate the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ that is wholly unprecedented and thus disruptive. That said, when it comes to subsequent Christian theology, like other ancient and medieval authors, Christians tended to regard truth as at least partly that which is to be preserved across time, looking towards the wisdom of ancient sources, rather than solely lying ahead of us in a linear progression narrative. In the last several centuries, as Christians in some quarters have taken on various aspects of what we might call modernity's compulsion towards seeing truth as something that always has yet to be discovered in the future, rather than preserved in the past, I would argue that the subsequent drive towards seeing innovation as an unqualified good, as something which is always desirable, no matter what, has had the unfortunate side effect of tying things like truth, beauty, and meaning to the same drives for constant innovation that shape our lives in other spheres. For instance, unfettered neoliberal capitalism. And so, to the extent that this helps demonstrate that Pärt's music, his art, sits at that same uneasy yet generative point of tension between conservation and innovation that I'm saying that Christian theology also occupies, then from a theological perspective, that is far superior to any narrative that would, frankly, paint an aesthetic picture of him as some unprecedented visionary, especially if painting that picture is for the purpose of making his phenomenon more marketable. We've seen what that marketing looks like in the world. And it's my contention, along with many scholars, that this move to locate Pärt as some emissary from the esoteric heavens, rather than what I believe him to be, which is a deeply sensitive listener, a creative mirror and refractor of his contexts, it's to miss something essential about his art to paint that one-sided esoteric picture of him. And it also, frankly, reduces his achievement to something like, and I'm going to put this a little bit strongly, something like a cheap peddling of a spiritual ambiance for a meaning-starved age. And I don't think that one needs to be Christian, to your point, Peter. I don't think that one needs to be Christian or even traditionally religious to see that as a problem. And I really want to stress that. I think that any genuine spirituality, Christian or otherwise, needs to be aware of the danger of this sort of guru making. And furthermore, to the extent that Pärt's art is described as mystical, to take another theological term, then contextualizing him within musical scholarship, as this volume tries to do, coheres with the best trends in studies of Christian mysticism. Here's what I mean by that. For several generations of scholars of mysticism, the idea that mystics themselves receive some sort of sui generis, unprecedented revelation from the heavens in a way that disrupts the status quo, truth be told, that was a lot of the appeal of the study of mysticism, especially to the extent that it was caught up in the same kind of love for pure innovation. However, in the last few decades, more careful study of mysticism has demonstrated that in the realm of mysticism, as well as in the broader realm of human achievement, the real virtuosity of the people whom we call mystics, Julian of Norwich, Meister Eckhart, so on, had less to do with them purely being channels for innovative messages or images. And, in their context, that kind of thing would have been regarded as Gnostic at best and perhaps demonic at worst. Moreover, their achievement was more about doing what this volume suggests that Pärt does, slowly and skillfully absorbing practices over long periods of time, tentatively engaging those practices in a community of other devotees, past and present, and then gradually allowing this habitus to bring forth new insights into that which is being sought, whether what's being sought is musical excellence or God. And as we hear from Pärt himself, often those two goals of what is being sought are inextricable from each other. So what I'm saying is that mystic insights and also music that we might want to call mystical, if it's not to be either a shiny spiritual ambiance that's exchanged on a neoliberal market or a spiritually dangerous temptation towards hubris, it cannot and should not be a private gift that is vouchsafed to the esoteric few, but rather a communal product of traditions across time, channeled by virtuosos who have the humility to place themselves in a creatively receptive position across these multiple currents, and to bring forth from them something that is truly unique and excellent. So perhaps the boldest claim, the boldest theological claim that this volume makes is that as it is with the life of the spirit, so with the life of art. And it's precisely for that reason that Pärt's achievement is all the more remarkable and all the more valuable.
That is just fantastic, Rob. It's ironic that one of the great misconceptions about the word mystical and mystic is that it has to do with something utterly intangible, whereas technically in the history of all religions, the mystics are the practitioners. They're the ones who are doing, they're the ones who are actually involved in these embodied acts and exercises. And so it's wonderful to sort of demystify that word. That's part of what you've done for us this afternoon. You've also shown us that the books focus on embodiment. It's not just the effect on the body of the music, which in turn is a sonic effect. It's the effect of moving air, but it's embodiment within human history and within cultural history. And that's such a common theme, unintended when we got this set of speakers together, but it turned out to run through the thematically through Thomas Seaton, Chris May, Kevin Carnes, and others, that that tintinnabuli did not come out of nowhere, that it didn't just come out of plain chant and Franco-Flemish 15th century composers, but it came out of the entire milieu that was cooking in Pärt's day in Eastern Europe. And so embodiment really goes, it speaks to more than just the music. It speaks to, as you've put it beautifully just now, to Pärt's deep listening to his time.
Yeah, and I think, why would we want it to come out of nowhere? It's I think that's one of the questions to ask, which we can think about another time. This idea that there would be this vision that absents itself from this very tender process of a community deciding whether this vision truly does fit, whether that's the community of a church or a community of artists. I think there are reasons why we want this to be a long, slow, evolving process rather than, again, a situation of guru making, musical or otherwise.
Rob, thank you so much. This is also a perfect way to introduce our next speaker, and that's Jaanika Peerna, whom I had the joy of meeting. It was my own book, Out of Silence, was being launched at an event in New York. When was it, 2015 at some point? And Jaanika introduced herself and gave me her book called Storms and Silences. And I became an immediate fan of her work, and we have remained in touch ever since. Jaanika's work is talk about embodiment. Not only is it, does it speak very viscerally, but it also, she creates work and also is a performance artist, such that some of her larger works, including room-size installations, are not only composed but performed, and the performance is a part of the art itself. Jaanika, in you, we have somebody who's really well positioned to say something on this theme of embodiment, as an Estonian yourself as well, and part of the whole world and zeitgeist that Pärt comes from. I really look forward to what you'll talk to us today about.
Thank you. Wow, I feel like a student here. Definitely, because my background and my expertise, which we all have different kinds, is definitely coming from more just really listening and letting myself being moved. Definitely hours and hours of listening to Pärt's music in my art studio. And also about 7 or 8 years ago, I've made actually performances with dancers and using Arvo Pärt's music. But today, first of all, I do have the book. I am one of the lucky ones. I don't know how many of you, but I have it right here, and it's been on my side of my bed today. I woke up and reading this. So anyway, but I was thinking, since I'm not as eloquent in speaking, and since we started listening to the music, I'm going to show you some photographs from my most recent performance I did in October in Brooklyn, in New York City. And these photos are taken by a very good photographer, Effie Gray. And what I'd just like us to do is look at them all together. And I wonder, what are the sounds, which pieces of Pärt's compositions perhaps come up in your body, in your mind? What are they evoking? Because the more I listen today to all of you, the more I see how many connections there are between the performance that's called actually Glacier Elegy and what was even discussed today, what's discussed in the book in these different chapters. So I'm going to share my screen for this, and I'll just do you see my screen? Yeah? Okay. I'm not going to add to it much. Why don't we just look through it and see what we can hear in terms of sounds, because we only have the visual here to cue us. Thought I can just press and show you the next one, but no. Why is that? I guess we have to do this. Very curious. Of course, it's not perfect to be showing, and we've been on the screen so much, but for me, a lot of these silences that I've been looking for in between the lines I make, the connections between humans that are created, the very specific details, the elements that make up the bigger atmospheric compositions. A lot of these things sort of I've started to think of it in my own practice a little new way, but I leave it here for us to continue all together.
People should feel free to begin entering questions or thoughts or impressions in the chat window. At any point, you can begin doing that. Jaanika, I find knowing your work and seeing, especially the classic kind of Peerna artwork that was part of that performance, there's something that thematically links it very much, and it has to do with line and the flow of line. The word flow is a word that rings very powerfully when I behold your work. Flow. Is there something perhaps that we can link between this idea of flow and Pärt's music?
Pärt's music gives the anyway, now I could just describe. I remember a moment from my studio working and listening, and it also there are moments when you're really cued to the music, but then you kind of flowing. And there was this very, very interesting moment when all of a sudden I realized I see his music. It's not, I would say, more than hearing, I see it. And there is a lot of flow there. So while I was drawing and listening, I can't even remember which piece it was at the time. I just remember the absolute collaboration between the sounds that I was hearing and what I was making, because there was this flow-like sound wafts, and then that I saw in the air by just hearing the sounds. And here comes the sound. And then I have to tell you, we're close to West Point here on Hudson River, and there are some big events happening. So as the sound was coming as a visual to me, I was responding to it with my pencils on paper. So it was this collaboration. And when you say the word flow, that really brings me back to that very moment. And from there, you take the next one. So it's just seeing the sounds and adding to it, sort of collaborating with it. The same way I was collaborating during this performance, we were looking at it with the elements that were there, with the other dancer who was there, with the artwork that took new shapes and forms constantly. So I think Arvo's music has this quality of no beginning and no end. It really just meanders through different points and obstacles and just sort of going.
Do any of the other panelists have a comment for Jaanika or a question for Jaanika? I'd be very interested if other folks would weigh in. Rob, Jeffers, Maria.
I have to unmute myself. Jaanika, you asked us to imagine what we might hear. And then since we're talking about Arvo Pärt, I found myself somehow every time, I think it must be you, the person who's offering like a piece of ice or something. I kept thinking of like Spiegel and Spiegel, like something very like open and like giving. And then the woman who had I don't know what the material is, but with all the lines and is cut through, and she seemed to struggle. And I kept thinking about like bits of fratres that are so like kind of tangled up with each other. So those were my kind of initial responses since you asked us to think about what we might hear. That's in my head, that was the soundtrack I created.
That's very interesting, because a performance I made 7 years ago with a dancer, Jane Thornquist, we used fratres for that very performance. But yeah, I do wonder, because everybody who's here today, you've listened to his compositions, to Arvo Pärt's compositions so much. So I am very curious, like which pieces come up when perhaps looking at this visual information that we can convey through photography.
For me, it was less about a direct tie to a piece and more the way you captured the natural setting into which this gift is being offered. It called to mind, we began this podcast by listening to Depachem, and I was at a performance one time in basically a warehouse where there was a string quartet set up along with a small choir, and they performed Depachem, and about halfway through the piece, it was next to a train yard, and a train came through. And at first I thought, oh no, the piece is ruined, or the performance is ruined. But then there was something about it, though. No, that's the exact point. In the midst of all this noise, in the midst of all this industry, in the midst of all the clamor of life, there is this sort of eruption of peace. And your visuals had a very similar effect on me. It seemed like that's what the offering was in the midst of it all.
Right, yeah. The performance was really having this one piece of block of ice and in the middle of a public park. And there were a few people knew that this is going on, but mostly it was just a Dumbo Pebble Beach, activity, Sunday, daytime. And it was the first time I did a performance that outdoors in a public space where people weren't necessarily there for this. So it did feel like a very humble offering, what I had to offer. And it's good. It even came through these few photos.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm ready to begin sort of bringing this event to a close. We've come just over an hour, which was our goal. Unless there is anything that any of our panelists would like to add, or if there's something further that someone wants to contribute through the chat window, I can begin winding it down and giving some closing words of thanks. First and foremost, thank you to our panelists, for Jaanika, Rob, Jeffers, Maria. It's such a pleasure to work with you on the way to this book, but also on the way to this event, and to hear such interesting things. I think we were all students, Jaanika, today, not just you. Thank you again also to the New York Consulate General, Estonian Consulate General. Jaanika, you work there as the attaché of the Ministry of Culture, and your whole office there was very supportive of this. Fordham University Press also supports this event very warmly and supported us so kindly in the production of this book, so thoughtfully in everything that we were working on with this book. Fordham Press made it a reality. Don't forget to buy the book. And today you get a discount of 30% if you enter the discount code ARVO30, ARVO30 in the promotion code. I'm not sure how that works internationally, but somehow it'll work. So thank you to Fordham Press as well. And thank you to all of you who devoted some time to your afternoon, or in some cases your evening or midnight, wherever you are in the globe, to this event. And let's hope that we can organize other such events around this book and around the wonderful music of Arvo Pärt. I'll add one more thing, and that is that the Arvo Pärt Center in Laulasmaa, Estonia, has also just recently put out a new book of their own that focuses on the architecture of that amazing building that opened just over 2 years ago in Estonia. It is a museum, archive, concert hall, whose design is absolutely brilliant, and their book is a kind of a philosophical and pictorial overview of the building. And so go to the Arvo Pärt Center website and you'll have a look at that as well. All right, so thanks everyone. And that's it from us this afternoon. Bye-bye, everyone.